There's now Ranella had a show where he cooked the testicles, and he's like, you just throw them in here with butter, and you do this, and you cook them, and they pop, and then and then you eat them. Okay, I've done that like 10 times, and it's not particularly pleasing.
I've had bull. I haven't tried deer, but I've had cattle, bull.
They're like rubber. Like maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I've watched this show a couple times. I'm like, you just chew for a long time. And some kind of
2 to 3 million year old whitetail fossils in Florida that are indistinguishable from today's whitetail.
That's insane. There's a lot of concern around mule deer.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the mule deer working group that I'm a part of is trying to work on some of those issues that are impacting mule deer in the West. And highways and roads and all of that stuff, you think about, they have to traverse that twice a year. And that particular migration route that was 150 miles, they spend 4 months of the year in transit.
Okay, folks, welcome to the Gritty Bowman podcast. We are at the Western Hunt Expo, and I am joined again by Jim Heffelfinger. And did we ever establish the origin of Heffelfinger?
I don't think we talked about that. It's Swiss German.
Is it?
And I just at Christmas did the genetic test.
Uh-huh.
And I know that on my father's side, my grandmother is English and the Heffelfinger is Swiss German. And I know my mother's side is pretty much all German. So I did the genetic test, and it comes back I'm 3/4 German and 1/4 English.
Nice.
No surprises there.
I need to go do that. You know what's funny about those genetic tests, or surprising? You'll have someone come along. Maybe you can talk about this since you are a biologist and you know all about this genetic stuff.
I've done a bunch of genetic work with real geneticists, but I've done work with them.
Yeah. We'll have someone get the testing done. Their parent comes out like, I don't know, 80% Greek and 20% like Turkish or something. And then their child comes out like 80% English and 20% Irish and like a tiny bit of Greek.
Or siblings from the same parents have slightly different percentages, and sometimes fairly big different percentages. And that can happen because when they do those genetic tests, they're not testing your whole genome and really knowing exactly what you are. They have certain marker genes, and they know that, or not genes, but alleles, and they know that this allele is really common in England, and that allele is really common in England. And so when they look at several of those markers, they just kind of clump them in groups. But those are only like indicators, and each one of those represent thousands and thousands of alleles. So if two siblings, they of course are different a little bit genetically, and so depending on what alleles they get, it can put them in different categories. So you have to think of it as just a really broad general thing.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was surprised. I was like, is this a byproduct of the test being not as accurate, or is it just also how genetics play out? I mean, you can have, I know I used to breed a lot of dogs, and, people would always do this research on the parents, and then they'd come to me and they'd be like, okay, I want a pup from your parents. That's what I want. And I'm like, great, and then, then we would always temperament the pups at a certain age and do some tests for intelligence and other things and temperament, and you'd end up with dogs. And I would tell people, look, I'm one of 8 kids at my house, right? And
not all the same.
We are not the same. Like, my brother and I are as different as they come. We're both from the same parents.
Yep.
And it's the same with a litter of pups.
Yep, exactly.
You can have some that are just like the parents, and you have some nothing like the parents. Just because they came out of that pairing doesn't mean that the offspring is going to turn out.
Yep. Yep.
And
each individual, that DNA, it's called recombinant DNA for a reason, because it recombines into different, and that's what gives us all our diversity. It recombines in every individual, even from the same parent. I mean, obviously, all siblings aren't identical twins.
Yep. Yeah. So and after testing different dogs, and there were a lot of telltale signs like, oh yeah, that's just like her mother. It's just like you could see these, but then there were always those pups that seemed to be from
outer
Mars.
Space.
Yeah. So so it's really, really interesting. So I'm holding a Arizona Wildlife Views. Is this periodical magazine?
It's a state magazine. It comes out every 2 months.
State magazine. Yeah. I've got it right here, folks. That are anyone watching the podcast instead of listening to it. I got it in my hands, and on the cover, you have the title says "Girl Gang: The Tribal Life of the Curious Coati."
Yes, you pronounce it's kind of I guess it's a Spanish derivation, so you pronounce every syllable Coati.
Coati, and it's Coati. Coatimundi?
Yeah, the true name of it is Coatimundi.
Coatimundi.
It just gets that shortened name because that's easier.
So is it Mundi?
Coatimundi. Coatimundi. It is E. Even though it ends with an I, it's a Coatimundi.
So, I shot one of these.
Or is it a Cousimundi?
Dude, I don't know. Like, I've called it something different every time.
Cousimundi and Cousimundi.
So, for folks that are listening, I talked about this a little bit, but this article in here, I'm excited. Jim brought me this magazine. I'm going to take a look at it and learn more about the Coati.
Pretty interesting critters.
Yeah, they taste good. They taste good.
Yeah, that's right.
When Hank Shaw cooks them, they taste really good.
Yeah, that's the big caveat, I think. I'm not sure I could get them to taste good.
But the meat was very, it was a lot. Like, when we took it apart, Hank was like, being that this Coati is related to some degree to it's in the raccoon family.
Mm-hmm.
He expected the meat to be red, almost purple. Mm-hmm. Just that's the color of raccoon flesh. Yeah. And when we got the Coati open, it doesn't look anything like that.
Yeah, I didn't see it raw. I just came when it was just about done on the stove.
It looks like a chicken leg.
That's interesting. It'd be that light.
It's totally light, almost lighter, almost like pork.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then when it cooked a lot like pork too.
Yeah.
I mean, almost identically like pork. And people ask me, what did it taste like? I'm like, it tasted like pork ribs, but even
a little
like
denser.
Yeah. Well, it depends on which piece you got.
That's true. Yeah.
Because when I ate the back straps, they melted in your mouth and they had a layer of fat on them, which is the concern when you're cooking, wild game animal. It's like, is the fat going to be...
You don't know if their fat's going to be good or not.
Yeah, you don't know if their fat's going to taste good or taste bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to depend on the animal. It also depends heavily on what it ate.
Yeah.
Because like with bears, sometimes bears are the most succulent bear fat you've ever had, and sometimes it's disgusting.
Yeah, I shot a young bear once, and it was fantastic. It was amazing.
Yeah, same here. I've shot a couple bears. I've eaten a lot of bear, and the bears off of Prince of Wales Island that are big, that roam the coastline, they eat a lot of like mussels and I think fish. Their fat tastes like old dead fish.
Oh, interesting.
Tastes like dead salmon. Like it has that smell even when you cook it in the house. And then I've shot a few bears. Like my buddy shot a nice big boar in Oregon in the Blues, and it was eating sweet onions, digging tubers up out of the ground and eating those constantly, and a lot of there's no rivers, no fish really. Probably scrounging and digging up gophers or things like that. But for the most part, it probably ate a lot of
mammals, probably.
Mammals and then greens, and berries. Lots of berries up there, blueberries and stuff, wild berries. And that was some of the best meat I've ever eaten.
Wow.
So you see Stephen Ranella shoot a few bears up in like blueberry patches, and my friend Ryan Lampers as well up in Washington, and they taste like blueberries, like blueberry flavored.
That's amazing.
Bear meat. So, so what do you know about coatis?
Just been living and working in Coati country for 26 years, and as a biologist in the office, you get these calls and people say, we saw this troop of monkeys across the road in front of them. And so we know exactly what that is all the time. But they're interesting critters. They're down in riparian and river areas, and usually flipping rocks over, looking for little invertebrates and bugs underneath there. And
when Randy Newberg was on that stock on the group, first of all, we thought there was only one. Thought it was the same one I had gone after the day before. And I spotted it in some binos, so he was on the hunt. But when he got down there was like 30 or more.
Yeah. A lot of times you surprise them. You come down into a little creek area, and then all of a sudden they're all over there.
Yep. So they're all over, and he's like, whoa. And before they got in close, they just heard the noise. And Marcus, his cameraman, was like, dude, I just heard like just this huge racket of trees and things moving. And then he goes, and I heard a bunch of tin cans banging together. And he's like, what is that? And then there was a pile of old cans down there, and those things were like knocking them together and moving them around and carrying them, making noises with them. He's like, they're like little monkeys, like curious little monkeys.
When they walk, they hold their tail up, a real thin, long raccoon-like tail, and they hold it up like an upside-down J through the grass, and it may be like with some of the primates, a way to keep track of each other in the tall grass. But that's what really gives them that monkey look. When they cross the road, all the tails will be up like lemurs or something.
Yep. And those tails are, I don't know, like 2.5. How long are they? Do you know? 2 feet?
Probably no more than 2 feet.
They seem long when you compare them to their bodies.
Yeah, because it looks like a raccoon, but the tail is different than a raccoon.
I mean, that's things like
that's a little baby
more
one.
More than twice its length.
Mm-hmm.
The male that I came across was like that. I mean, the tail just seemed to go forever.
Yeah, so they travel in groups, but the males just become much bigger and much darker, and sometimes travel out kind of by themselves. They don't spend time with a troop all the time. Yeah,
so they say it's a balancing tool, the tail.
Yep, just like monkeys and lemurs, they can do that too.
Also a communication device.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's definitely a major tool, because to get a tail that long,
it has to have a purpose, right?
Yeah,
or a couple purposes.
Yeah,
yep.
And it's not thick and bushy so much like a raccoon or anything. I mean, it's kind of long and slender.
More monkey-like, it really is. Mm-hmm. And it's even called a troop.
Yeah,
we even call it a troop just because they're so monkey-like.
When I talked to John Odell, he was talking about how it's almost, what do you call it? Like a monkey tail or like a possum, where it actually can wrap around a tree, and it's like another
for some balance. Yeah, sure. Another touch point if you're up in a tree.
I forget what the term he used.
Prehensile.
Mm-hmm. He said it's not prehensile.
Yeah, they don't hang from them or anything.
It does look like it, the way that it like moves around as they're walking.
Yeah. Yep.
So super cool animal. So Arizona, like most of the people that have seen this, I'd say 95% are like that. They didn't know this animal even was in the United States.
Right. Yep. And it is a South American, it's a Central American and South American kind of species. And this is just that northern tip of their distribution up into Arizona.
Because I had a lot of people actually write in and say, hey, I saw a lot of those when I was, in South America or Central America. Right. They're like, but I didn't even know we had them in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Their full name is a white-nosed coati. Okay. They have that black mask, and then they have a little white towards the end of their black nose pad. So
I'm really curious, because after seeing the nose and the mouth and the snout and lots of nicknames, I'm very curious. I want to learn more about them. It says that they emit a soft chirping sound. They sounded to me a little bit like a raccoon chirping.
Mm-hmm. And anytime you got an animal that's really social and in a group, there's always vocalizations, because they're communicating all the time.
So much vocalization. Mm-hmm. And then when I shot mine, I got surrounded by them, and like they were all around me like a bunch of monkeys sitting on their haunches. Yeah. Now you can hunt the coati. You can take one a year, right, with your small game license.
Yep.
And they live. I mean, where we were at, they were all the way right there on the border of Arizona and Mexico.
Of course, they go down south into South Central America.
But John was telling me that their distribution has moved up quite a bit further north.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We ran into someone on elk hunt by Flagstaff, and that's really surprising.
That's pretty north.
Yeah, you think of them as
snow up
Central
there.
America. I know. And I'm not sure what they do. Same with the javelina that are up there. We get snow up there, and you got to wonder what some of those tropical animals do for extended periods of time when there's snow. Yeah. I know the javelina go underneath people's porches and live under there for a couple of weeks, but I'm not sure what they do.
Well, you can hunt javelina at the same time you're hunting coati.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm much more interested in hunting them now that I've eaten them.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm like, hey, okay, I'm down with this.
That's the way I was with jackrabbits. Jackrabbits are fun to hunt, but I don't want to shoot jackrabbits and leave them. And a friend of mine eats them all the time, and he got us into shooting jackrabbits, and that really makes it fun because, boy, we clean up the meat, bring it home, and cook it all kinds of different ways.
Well, and a few people mentioned how when you shoot a jackrabbit, you shoot one jackrabbit, it's the same as shooting a Coues deer.
Yeah, exactly. You only need a couple.
I actually saw a couple jackrabbits that I thought, I mean, they're gigantic.
Mm-hmm.
Gigantic.
Yeah, 8 to 10 pounds for an antelope jackrabbit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I shot some Coues or some Sitka blacktails on Prince of Wales Island, and I came back with on a young buck, skinned it all out, deboned it, the whole deal. I ended up with like 28 pounds of meat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, gosh,
I have a picture of my
Jim.
kids holding up jackrabbits and a picture of the same kids holding up young wild hogs we shot in Texas, and because of the perspective of the camera, they look the same size.
Yeah. Well, Hank cooked that up for us too, and that was really good. And
that was really good.
I think it's really neat to see these different small game species being utilized, and have someone like Hank there to help educate on how to make these meats, because you can't treat them like a domestic rabbit or a domestic chicken or something.
Right. Yeah. People say, well, this tastes a little off. It doesn't taste off. That's what that animal tastes like. You can't expect it to taste like chicken or beef or pork, because it's not a chicken or beef or pork. So different animals are going to taste a little different, but it doesn't mean that it's bad because it's not like our domestic meat. It's just different.
Well, and they're so lean, the wild ones, that it's trickier to cook.
Right.
Anytime you have to cook something
anyway.
lean, you got to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Like these animals aren't sitting in a pen either. Like they're flapping their wings like for tens of thousands of miles, and so they're going to have a muscular, tough chest.
Yeah, and they have some fat, but they burn that fat at certain times of the year, and they're pretty lean. So yeah, wet methods and long cooking. You have to pay attention and cook it a little different.
Yeah,
it took me a long time to just learn how to cook venison right. I was trying to put it in the crock pot and stuff, but then after a while, you learn how to cook a steak on a grill. Where it's fantastic, but it takes a while to just kind of get into that and learn that.
And one thing that Hank brought up, he's like, deer to deer, it's different. It's like, just because you shoot two blacktails standing next to each other in the same place, he's like, one can be just super tender and just some reason it just melts in your mouth, and the other one can be pretty tough and So once you figure that out, you adapt your cooking method to deal with the cut and that specific animal, not just species. Mm-hmm. So always,
I've had elk that taste very different from one another. 2 elk, that taste very different.
Me too. What's the best big game animal you've ever taken and then eaten? Like it just was the best.
That bear I mentioned was, I gave up some of that bear meat to someone else that hadn't hunted bears in a while, and he said, "I'm going to start hunting bears again." He said, "I don't know what it was about that, but you would cook. We'd make bear burger, and you'd cook it in the pan, and it just smelled like grade A fresh beef. I mean, it just smelled really clean and really good." I think anytime you hunt inland bears, you get that. I mean, a lot of that. This was in the Chiricahuas down southeastern Arizona. And then I've had, and we shoot a lot of young deer in our family, and so that gives us an advantage when you're talking about taste. But the mule deer that I shot this year, which wasn't very young, it was 3.5 years old, but that's tasting really good right now.
Yeah. I would say that the Oklahoma whitetail buck that I shot this year, and he's a mature buck, one probably 4-year-old deer, 5-year-old deer. I don't know why, but one of the best tasting big game animals I've ever taken, and I've taken a lot of different ones and eaten all of them. And then I shot an elk, a coastal, like not a coastal elk, but an elk in Oregon that lived near farms and stuff. And that, for some reason, and it was an old bull, and it just tender and delicious.
Yeah, that 3.5-year-old deer that I shot this year was a desert mule deer, 3x4 antlers, and I didn't share pictures of the antlers with anybody. Social media or by email, I shared a picture of the backstrap laying on a cutting board. It was a beautiful backstrap. And people would say, "Send me a picture of your deer," and I just send that. That's the only picture I shared with anybody all year. Here's my deer. Isn't it beautiful? And the universal response was, "That is a gorgeous deer. I love that. That looks beautiful."
Yeah, I like that too. It really does emphasize, what some of the deepest values for what you do. So
I have 4 boys. We've always put the meat in high regard. I mean, that's really what we want. We want some meat in the freezer.
I'm to the point now though where like I'm still dealing with liver. Okay, liver, I eat it. I eat all of it, but and it's okay. It's just
my mother cooked beef liver and onions growing up, and we all hated it. And she kept cooking it because it was probably $3 to feed 6 of us. And so I have a hard time cooking any liver.
I probably eat it every couple weeks.
Oh, really?
Little liver and onions, and I'm trying to figure out how to make it. We'll soak it in milk. We'll do this different things, and it's not that it tastes bad. Just it tastes like liver, and liver has a taste, and I think people like it or don't. My buddy Tim Burnett at Solo Hunter, he loves liver.
I love liverwurst.
Loves liver.
Braunschweiger liverwurst. Yeah. We grew up in a German family, and I love that. But
yeah, my thing though nowadays has been heart. I love heart.
I know it.
I want heart tacos. I put heart, and heart is my thing.
I first time I had heart, I was shocked at how tender it was. I thought a meat that or a muscle that pumps constantly has to be really tough, and it isn't. It's amazing.
No,
it's really amazing.
And heart tacos have become kind of my. It's like the nice thing about it is you don't need to age a heart at all.
Yeah.
Like soon you can pull it out in minutes after killing the animal and cook it right there in camp, and it's the same.
We cooked one up at a deer check station one time for lunch and sliced it in rings, marinated it in Italian salad dressing, cooked it on a Coleman stove. We just cooked it up there until the liquid kind of disappeared and put it in.
Yeah, it's not hard to cook it either. It's like you just cook it. You can't screw it up really. So there's now Ranella had a show where he cooked the testicles, and he's like, you just throw them in here with butter and you do this and you cook them and they pop, and then and then you eat them. Okay, I've done that like 10 times, and it's not particularly pleasing.
I've had bull. I haven't tried deer, but I've had cattle, bull.
They're like rubber. Like maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I've watched this show a couple times. I'm like, you just chew for a long time, and I'm not sure. Like I looked up their nutritional value and stuff, and they're not anything too special.
Not to go through the trouble. Deer nuggets.
I mean, you are salvaging like as much of the animal as you can in that case.
That's satisfying. And
it's easy. I mean, they got you got 2 little chunks of meat there, and you throw it on, and it's all right. But my wife and kids are like, no, I ain't.
That's where the line is.
We're done, Dad. Like that's all you. So, so Jim, you're a deer biologist.
Yep.
And where did you go to school?
I went to got my bachelor's degree at UW Wisconsin Stevens Point. I graduated in '86, and at the time there was actually a survey among wildlife programs throughout the country, and that's a small town in central Wisconsin and a fairly small university, but it was the largest undergraduate wildlife school in the country. And it's well known as being a really strong natural resources school. So it was really neat that I was able to be in a small town Wisconsin because I grew up in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, and be at a school that was really well known and good. And then I did a master's degree in South Texas at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. And that was a similar situation where it was a small town in Texas, but within that university they had the Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute, which was really well known in our profession for doing some really good research. So I kind of hit it right with my undergraduate and graduate degrees.
I want to ask you some questions around deer evolution, biology, evolution primarily, because I've been a big fan of hunting blacktail deer.
Right.
And Columbian blacktail and Sitka. And so for a while there, I read literature where they said, they talked about the origin of blacktail. And
that Mueller's a hybrid between blacktails and whitetails.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
And that was Valerius Geist and Larry, he's a good friend of mine. I always stay in contact with him. But what happened was, initially, they started doing, when wildlife genetics was just starting to be used in the deer family, they did some research and they found out there's nuclear DNA, and that's inside the nucleus, and then the cell around there has mitochondrial DNA, and that comes only from your mother. It's floating around in the cell outside the nucleus. But they started doing some research on that DNA that's inherited from your mother, and they found out that blacktails have very different mitochondrial DNA. And in fact, mule deer and whitetail have very, very similar mitochondrial DNA, and blacktails are different. So that spawned a theory at that time that, well, that's probably because you had blacktails and you had whitetails, and they interbred, and the mule deer got that maternally inherited mitochondrial DNA from the whitetails, from whitetail mothers.
That's the articles I read. This is a long time ago.
And so that was the initial, and it was a theory, and it made sense with that initial genetic work we did. But then they looked at nuclear DNA, and that's the DNA we were talking about before you get from your mother and your father, 50-50. When they looked at nuclear DNA, it was clear that blacktails and mule deer were one group and separate from whitetail. So it was just that was kind of a spurious early result that made sense with the early work, but work that came after that showed pretty clearly you have either 7 or 11 subspecies in the mule deer blacktail group. 2 of them are blacktail subspecies, the Columbian and the Sitka, and then you have a bunch of mule deer subspecies. Those are really one good species, mule deer and blacktail deer, and just subspecies separate from whitetail. But there was enough of that in print, of that mule deer being a Pleistocene hybrid, that is still really a prevalent conversation.
Yeah.
People think about that.
But the reality, so tell me the actual, what the science tells us today about the evolution of, so from what I've understood, like whitetails are 500, like, thousand, some kind of
2 to 3 million year old whitetail fossils in Florida that are indistinguishable from today's whitetail.
That's insane.
Million. When you think about human evolution, where we were 2 or 3 million years ago, and you think that there are whitetail fossils in Florida that look like whitetails today, that's amazing that animal has looked like that as long as it has. Now, and so you think about, what about the mule deer and blacktail deer fossils? So much of that northwestern North America was under glaciers and ground up, and the fossil record of western deer is really mixed up and confusing. In Florida, you can go in there and that hasn't been disturbed. You can pull these old fossils. In the West, all of that soil from the glaciers has been churned up so much, and the soil horizons that we can date and see how old these fossils are, it's all mixed up. So it's really difficult to talk about the fossil record of deer in western North America. And that's why it's hard to kind of figure that out once and for all.
Okay. So what blows my mind is that whitetail deer, have been around as long as they have. And so they're obviously, they're thriving right now. Thriving, Dan Flores, when I read American Serengeti and then Coatimundi, he's like, there's certain animals that win the lottery you win with human expansion.
Right, and those are it for sure.
Yeah. It's like coyotes and whitetails. They just thrive on human.
They thrive
expansion.
On disturbance. So you go in and do some logging, and whitetail habitat increases double, and a fire comes through. That's great for whitetails. Even urban development, you've got food, you've got shrubs that deer, ornamental shrubs you plant in people's yards, gardens, agriculture, all that stuff is good for whitetails, and so that's why you see the spread and how good they're doing.
When I was at the ATA show, I interviewed the guys at Suburban Bowhunter, cool dudes, and they are hunting whitetails in downtown Atlanta and stuff.
I know.
Dude, there's giant bucks and deer running all over neighborhoods. Like they don't care.
Yeah.
Whitetail don't even care.
They don't. And mule deer are a little different. Mule deer have not done as well with disturbance. They like disturbed habitat. When you go in there and disturb it, and you get forbs and browse come up, and that's what they love. But as far as the whole kind of human disturbance, they have not done as well as whitetail.
Yeah, because when you think about a critter like so you look at whitetail, and then you look at Sitka blacktail, and I look at mule deer, and I've hunted all three, and Sitka blacktail are fairly aggressive, like whitetail are.
Yeah, they have a lot of whitetail characteristics. It's weird.
They do, and then they live in cities, and they seem to be nonplussed by it, unfazed. They live right among neighborhoods. They live in downtown Portland. I'll see them around. But the one thing that I've noticed about blacktail above mule deer and whitetail are the nocturnal nature. They even when there's not hunting pressure, they're still something 90% nocturnal.
Yeah,
all year.
Yeah.
What's that
I'm
about?
not sure what that is. It could be an environment where they're in a lot of thick cover, and they're normally in thick cover, and and they found it advantageous. Maybe it's predator pressure through the eons. Found it advantageous to not be out there in the opening in that thick cover where they can be ambushed.
Yeah, makes some sense. I haven't figured it out. It's frustrating to hunt them, not because they are particularly as wily as the Coues Deer or something like that, but a couple of things I notice about Sitka blacktail that's so different than whitetail or mule deer. And not to say that, I mean, the classic, whitetail hunter is like, dude, there's a few giant whitetails, but they only come out at night. They're 9 and 10 years old, and they only come out at night.
Sure.
They figured it out, right? So, but blacktails will do that from birth,
Yeah.
So there's something there that's different. But another thing that I noticed is, and I think this absolutely is a byproduct of how they evolved in the location that they're in. Blacktail, when they get spooked, they don't run away like whitetails do. I've seen them bounce, and then stop, and then slowly step, look.
Yeah, that's the function of that thick cover. That probably works really well. Whereas whitetail in mule deer in the wide open rangelands, they can't just run a little bit. Of course, sometimes they do run a little and stop and look back at the ridge, and that's because they're open country animals and they use their vision a lot, and so they want to see the predator. And so mule deer sometimes will bounce away a little bit and then stop and look because they're curious on what that is, and that worked out really well before the advent of rifles, and doesn't work out so well.
Blacktail are extremely and then I'll see a blacktail move from, I'll be in a tree stand and I'll spot a big buck, and he'll come into just a thick area, and it'll take him 45 minutes to go 100 yards. And he takes one step and he just stands forever, and you're like,
he's looking for an eyeball, or
he's just
mountain lion.
They won't step a step without just wait. They have no hurry to go anywhere. And
they do have small home ranges.
Yes,
because they have everything they need in a small area.
Yeah. So it's a different kind of animal. So tell me about the evolution of the deer.
Yeah, so we talked about 2 or 3 million year old whitetail fossils in Florida. They have a fossil called an Eocoleus gentriorum, which is about 6 to 7 million years old, and that seems to be the original North American whitetail, or North American deer. So deer didn't evolve in North America. The whole deer family really evolved in Asia and eastern, the Eurasian continent on the east side, and kind of China. And that's where the original deer fossils are. And then, of course, you've got all the European deer that came to be. And then one particular that they found fossils for, ancestor of all North American deer, probably 6 to 7 million years old, called the Eocoleus, that came across the Bering Strait. And that deer, and that's where the fossil record gets real fuzzy between 6 million years old and when we find whitetail fossils at 2 to 3 million years old. But somewhere in there, they divided up into an eastern deer and a western deer. There was 3 branches of North American deer. One was a Bretzia, and that was a whitetail-like deer with mule deer-like palmated antlers. And those fossils are found throughout the West, Bretzia. And then there was a Navajoceras, which was another kind of a whitetail-looking mid-sized North American deer that was a mountain deer. And when they look at the legs, they have mountain goat leg bones because they were short and stocky, and all the fossils are found in the mountains. And then that third branch was like an Oedicolius branch, which is our whitetail mule deer. And so the other 2 branches went extinct, and we have that fossil record. And there's no other living branches or survivors from those 2 branches. That one branch that survived was the Oedicolius, which split into a western deer and an eastern deer. And the eastern deer became the whitetail. The western deer became a mule deer, blacktail deer form. And then during one of the later glaciations in the west, blacktails, or one portion of that western deer, was isolated on the west coast of Oregon and Washington. And we did some genetic work for mule deer and blacktail deer throughout the West, and found that the highest center of diversity of blacktails is that western Oregon and Washington coast. And so that indicates that's where their refugia was. That's where they were trapped during an ice age, and that's where blacktails differentiated from the other mule deer. So the mule deer were kind of down in the southwest with the glaciers pushing them down there. Blacktails were against this ice-free coast. And then when the glaciers receded, you had blacktails and mule deer come back together, and we have a lot of areas where they come together there. So
we among blacktail hunters, it's there's this highway, and everything west of it is a blacktail, and everything east is a mule deer.
Right.
Which is pretty arbitrary.
Yeah, and it's arbitrary, but we did research. I led the collection of mule deer samples, and I know geneticists. One thing that I can do, I'm not a geneticist, but me being a state agency and having a real interest in science, I can communicate with other state agency biologists and get samples from deer throughout North America. And I collected 2,700 mule deer and blacktail deer samples from Alaska to Mexico, to the people that I know even in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And we used 1,800 of those samples, and we looked at mule deer and blacktail deer genetics throughout Western North America. And one thing, and then we went back in and we collected more samples along the blacktail mule deer boundary, and we did more work. And we were working with Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett that were partially funding this because they were interested in that line. How accurate is that highway, that line? And after all that genetic work, which we published in the journal Molecular Ecology, one of the most prestigious genetic journals, and we published it in Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett magazines. People may have seen the article, but we found that line that they drew years ago based on how the deer looked was probably as good as you're going to get. But there's mule deer that are over west of that line. There's blacktails over east of that line. But if you're going to draw a line somewhere, which you have to, it's about as good as you can do.
Well, and it's like this running kind of, we would call them bench legs,
right? Bench legs
or edge bucks. You know, it's like, well, where are you hunting? And then the thing is, some guy would come back with like 160-inch blacktail, and you're like, well, I mean, that's kind of more like a blacktail mule deer hybrid.
Right.
It's kind of a little of both.
And what Boone and Crockett has done based on our research is they've decided that, okay, that line is a pretty good line. We don't need to change that line based on the genetics. But if someone kills a mule or a blacktail deer that's on the left side of that line and entering it into that, they may, if it's questionable on how big that is, they may require a genetic test to be done. And since we laid the groundwork, we have the genetic test, and we at that.
And that's what I've seen lately is, someone will post, and hunters are the worst about this stuff. Someone will post some beautiful blacktail buck, and someone will say that's a mule deer.
Yep, I've seen that on the forum.
And then it's like it becomes this hateful battle. Yeah. And then they're like. And then the guy gets it genetically tested, and it comes back, okay, it's really heavily mule deer influenced, or no, it's like straight up blacktail, and it kind of clears the air. At the end of the day, who cares? Yeah. It's an awesome deer. It's an awesome deer either way, you know. And but I do find the personality of a blacktail very different from that of a mule deer. Mm-hmm. And then when you get into those areas where they're kind of mixed, you get sort of just a unique animal coming through.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think those agencies are doing more and more work with GPS radio collars, and they're going to learn a lot more about those animals summering up there and where they go in winter. And you'll have some summering, more in the mule deer, and then they may go west, for winter range.
Certainly,
they'll learn more about that.
The further west I get, like deep into the coastline, and I'm right on the coast, you get definitely a much different acting deer than you do in Eastern Oregon, where it's straight up mule deer. Yeah. And behavior's different, looks are different, and you can tell a huge difference between those animals, and it's pretty interesting to see. So one thing that personally, until this year, I'd never hunted whitetails. And so this year I hunted whitetails in 3 different states, and this 2017, and it was really cool. Whitetail are awesome. I've never been into them before, just kind of as a Western hunter, just kind of, whatever. But now I'm like, wow, I have a newfound appreciation for these animals. But mule deer, like, as well as mule deer since I live in Colorado now. But I got to tell you, like, my ultimate buck, like for me, the pinnacle of a deer, the most beautiful mount, the most beautiful buck for me is still a Columbian blacktail. The size of the ears, the double throat patch, the chocolate horns.
Yep, the double throat patch is a giveaway.
They just have beautiful proportions, and I love mule deer, but they got some giant ears, man. And they, I mean, they're just incredible. They're just, they're no doubt just
I love the mule deer that just come straight out and then straight up.
Like when you get it, there's no doubt that the antler mass on a mule deer and the characteristics of the antlers are also just
that was kind of my experiences. I grew up with whitetail, and then I did my master's degree in South Texas on coyote predation on mature whitetail bucks after the rut in classic South Texas, where you have almost a 1-to-1 buck-to-doe ratio, big mature age structure in whitetails. So I worked in that environment, and I guided and hunted in that environment with these giant whitetails, where you wouldn't even step on the brakes if something looked like it wasn't 150 Boone and Crockett. You didn't even bother looking at it. And these are classic big buck ranches. And then I became a biologist in Arizona, started flying helicopter surveys. And the first year, we'd have a whitetail. We're doing whitetail surveys, and we'd have a whitetail squirt under the helicopter. And one of the biologists would be going crazy about it, this gigantic buck. And we'd circle around and look at it. And we'd be looking at a 110-point Boone and Crockett buck. And I couldn't understand why they were so excited, and learned pretty quickly that is a big Coues whitetail buck. And so that was pretty disappointing to go from South Texas to southern Arizona. And that's why when I saw the first mule deer buck, I was like, that's a deer. That's a deer. And I just quickly gravitated to the mule deer side of things, even though growing up being a whitetail person.
Well, I find spot and stock mule deer some of the most fun hunting I've ever done.
It is. It's really fun.
Spot and stock Coues deer is some of the most frustrating hunting I've ever done.
I know. It is. They're amazing. You just tiptoe into a canyon, over the lip of a canyon, and they'll be sneaking out the backside of the back canyon.
I asked Remi Warren, he was here, because Coues deer are on my brain now. And I'm like, Remi, dude, how do you kill a Coues buck with a bow, spot and stock? And so he talked to me a little bit about it. Sounds like blind luck. Sounds like that's a big part of it.
It is a big part of it.
It's persistence and blind luck.
I wrote an article one time, a long time ago, where I said hunting is 100% luck. But there's some things that you can do to increase the chances that you might get lucky.
Yeah.
And there were some people that complained about that. They said, it's not luck, it's skill. But that was my way of saying that. Let's just agree it's all luck, and then try to work real hard to try to get lucky.
Yeah, as I he talked about finding some of those canyon bottoms where they're just solid rock, like a paved road. Mm-hmm. And there was a couple spots like that. And he's like, he'll hit one of those, and he said in the morning or something, and he'll just kind of just stand there.
Oh, and wait for him to cross?
Yeah, but he'll walk.
They don't like to linger too much in there.
You can walk on that, when you can walk on that rock and not make too much noise, because it's like walking on pavement.
Yeah, a lot of that sand down there, too.
Yeah. So he's like, he's actually creeping up that canyon. You got 200-300 yards of that, and you're mostly still hunting. You are still hunting.
Yep.
And you're just sort of hoping something comes by, but you're just moving a little bit, and you're standing there a long time. And I've done a lot of that for blacktail.
You can glass, too, as you're, it's not even just close still hunting. You can glass.
That's what I did the day I got closest to my biggest buck. On one of the days. The other time, though, we had a good wind, and it covered the sound of my approach.
Yeah, that's great.
The only thing was, every deer in that area was hyper skittish.
They do, yeah.
They do not like the wind.
And and they don't like it because they can't hear things sneaking up on them.
So they were like tucking in tight and trying to hide and do different things, and that was like, geez, man. They were very sensitive to the wind.
Yeah, and you watch deer like that in the wind. When the wind's blowing in their ears and they can't hear much,
they're just
freaking
see them,
out. But they're just, they're nervous. They're nervous.
Yeah. I did a stalk on a mule deer in Alberta this year and got real close to it. And the wind was blowing, and he just was like, the wind was blowing, he just was just constantly looking everywhere. And finally, he just was like, I can't stand this. And he stood up just to look around, not because he heard anything, just to check. And there I was at 80 yards standing behind him in the wide open in a field. And he's like, his eyes got like big as saucers, and he was out. And all that doesn't because he smelled me or heard me. He just is hyper aware of his surroundings, and he knew
he needed to stand up and look around once in a while,
every now and then. Otherwise, he's going to get got. So, tell me about mule deer in terms of their evolution, because they're so different than whitetail, and they're struggling. They struggle. Population and there's a lot of concern around mule deer.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the mule deer working group that I'm a part of is trying to work on some of those issues that are impacting mule deer in the West. But it really kind of stems to what we talked about, the idea that they don't do very well with human encroachment and human disturbance. And so they're different in that respect. And they should command a lot more of our attention and work to make sure that we preserve them. They're such an icon of the West.
Well, one of the things I had heard as a proposal for some of their decline was simply the fact that we just never realized how vast mule deer migrations were.
That's true, yeah, and we're learning a lot more and more about mule deer migration. There's a lot of cases where they hung GPS radio collars on, so they would get a fix every 2 hours or every 6 hours where that animal is, and it gets either recorded on the collar that biologists can get and download into their computer later, or some of it gets beamed right up to the satellites, and you can just pull it up on the website. But some of those collars that were put on animals, they thought they hung around in this local area, and they just kind of wanted to see how much area they use. And they find, like the red desert to hoback migration in Wyoming, they did that in the red desert and put some collars on some mule deer, and they went 150 miles up to Jackson, Wyoming, basically. So along that 150 miles, there was over 110 fence crossings, an uncountable number of changes in jurisdiction of who owns the land. And so you think about
highways and roads
and all of that stuff. You think about, they have to traverse that twice a year. And that particular migration route, that was 150 miles, they spend 4 months of the year in transit, in either going or coming back. So you think those corridors are extremely important. They're spending 4 months out of 12 months in that corridor, moving, crossing all of those fences. And someone could, along there, just put in a little housing development. It happens all the time across America. Little housing development, and if it's in the wrong spot, you can destroy the connectivity across these landscapes. And so as we learn more and more about these migration routes of not only mule deer, but elk and pronghorn and bighorn sheep, and you start mapping those and you stand back and you look at the map, you can't help but think about the landscape as almost like a living organism with these animals flowing from areas to other areas that they need to make it through the year. We never realized that. Yeah,
and it's concerning. I've heard though that you could collar a mule deer, and some of them don't go anywhere.
Yep. You've got some year-round residents, and there's some populations where a portion of the population, they found this in California and a lot of other places, portion of the population are migratory. They'll go down to winter range, or they'll go up to summer range, and the other half of the population will stay around, just kind of all year-round range. And there's disadvantages to migrating. It's kind of dangerous. And there's some nutritional advantages to migrating. And so it's kind of a trade-off that even in some populations, some individuals will take that risk of migration for the benefit and some won't. And they work together.
So fascinating.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So where do you picture, what do you think is the biggest, one of the biggest perils or risks to mule deer?
One of the things that has really, the reason that we don't have as many mule deer as we had back in the 50s and 60s is these long-term habitat changes that occur, and they occur so slow and insidiously that even in the lifetime of a biologist, you may not notice the change in the landscape. But through the decades, we have much more fire suppression, much less disturbance in the forest. And more fire suppression means forest canopies mature. They block out the sunlight. There's not as many shrubs, not as many forbs or weeds that really give mule deer nutrition and really raise the carrying capacity of the habitat in terms of how many deer can live there. And so you have less logging. You have less fires because of fire suppression. You have some of these forests just maturing without that kind of disturbance. In areas we have less grazing, and overgrazing is not good for mule deer populations because they'll eat the browse and they'll eat a lot of the forest. But years ago, that grazing still introduced some disturbance into the habitat, and if it wasn't constant, then you have the brush refurbishing. And so you had a lot of disturbance back then that kept bringing the habitat back to an earlier growth phase, which is really good for deer. And now we're kind of protecting habitat in a lot of cases. And you get these ponderosa pine forests with no shrubs and nothing but pine needles underneath it. And that's not deer habitat.
What do you think is, like, when you look at that and you see these, the mule deer doing what they do, and as you describe this, I think it was on Meat Eater podcast recently. They were asking the question, are we false in our idea of what the true mule deer population is because it had such a swelling increase because of disturbance?
Mm-hmm.
And so we were like, we need to get back to that. And
right.
Whatever that was is not realistic.
I think that's absolutely true. We kind of started doing wildlife management. 1937 is when Pittman Robertson came on. We started doing research in the late 30s, early 40s, and then we went into the 50s, and we had these high deer populations because we had a lot of disturbance, and we had historically high deer populations in the 40s and 50s and 60s in a lot of cases. And a lot of people go back to that memory of the good old days, and we need to get back there. But the truth is that was an unnatural high in the long-term deer population because of that habitat disturbance. We can't get back to those numbers of deer because we don't have that kind of disturbed habitat to hold those. So that's an important point, is that we can't look back to a certain point in time and say we need to get back to that, because that may not be the normal situation.
What about disease and CWD? And I've heard a number of shows on that, and I'm really curious about it. It seems like it heavily affects whitetail populations.
Yeah, I actually, when I heard Steve Rinella's one on that, where he interviewed the CWD leader, that was a fantastic podcast, and I actually provided a link to that podcast to some of the Western directors and all the Western biologists, because it was such a great 2-hour nugget of audio to get up to speed on someone who knows what's going on. And so the CWD situation is where 15 years ago, everybody was talking about it, everybody's doing research about it, everybody's worried about it, and then it just kind of faded from everybody's consciousness for about 10 years because it was there. We did some research. At that time, it didn't seem like it was growing a lot, and now you're hearing more and more about it, and for good reasons. There's some more recent research that has come to light that gives us reason to be more worried about CWD in the West. And it started in Colorado and in Wyoming was the epicenter. And in those states and in a lot of other places, first of all, it keeps spreading to new areas. And when it gets into new areas, it spreads in prevalence there. In Colorado and Wyoming, they've got some game management units that are up to 40, nearly 50% of the deer that have it.
Right.
And when you've got prevalence rates like that, it's going to start affecting abundance. Earlier we said it's probably not going to be something that's really going to affect the number of deer out there. Some just have it. We're finding out that's not really true, that it can affect the abundance of deer. And then more recently, there's some research that is still being done and not released, but preliminary information was released where they fed macaques venison from CWD-infected deer. And the macaques, which are primates like us, were infected with a similar brain disease.
Yeah.
And the scary part is that meat came from CWD positive animals, but they were preclinical. They weren't even showing signs of CWD yet, and they were fed that venison. So there's some reasons why, understandably, a lot of us are more and more concerned about CWD, and we need to really ramp up our research. Another interesting thing is that genetically, there's some alleles or some genes that some individual deer have that give them some measure of protection against CWD. It doesn't make them CWD proof, but it delays the onset before they really get clinical signs. And they found if you have that genetic code, those deer don't get sick and die right away. They live a lot longer. And so since they live longer, they breed more seasons.
I was going to say that could be good and bad.
Predictably, you see in populations now, they've even documented that gene is increasing in prevalence. That's evolution in progress right there. Mm-hmm. It's increasing in prevalence to give this disease
natural
resistance.
Selection.
Mm-hmm. And so that could be a good thing. The wildlife veterinarians, though, will talk about the fact that, okay, the longer it stays on the landscape, does that mean it's shedding infectious prions longer? So there's a lot of research that needs to be done for sure. But that's why people are hearing more and more about CWD, and they shouldn't be brushing it off because it's been around for a long time. It's spreading and it's increasing in prevalence, and I think you'll see some Western agencies that may be trying some things in certain game management units with high prevalence rates. And unfortunately, what spreads CWD and what increases prevalence is it's common in mature bucks. And so if you wanted to reduce the CWD prevalence in an area, theoretically, if there was no social backlash, you'd knock that buck age structure down. You'd get buck to doe ratios that were 1 to 10, and that would that might theoretically reduce the spread of CWD, but obviously that comes with a huge social cost for those of us that like to hunt deer.
Because
and financial,
I mean, hunters often want to hunt the big ones in states that offer that opportunity, and they pay the dollars for it.
Absolutely. You may see some state agencies. We in the Mule Deer Working Group produce some research guidelines that if an agency wanted to test some of these things in one game management unit, here's some structured guidelines that would make it more useful to everybody else. So you may see some agencies take 1 or 2 game management units and try to lower the buck age structure, and I hope that hunters don't come unglued. I hope they support a little bit of research. It's not going to happen statewide, but we need to learn more about CWD in that way.
I think it's not about the hunter; it's about the animal. You know, I hear Stephen Ranella brought up this question a few times where he said, you know, if you told me today, this is a nice litmus test for everybody,
right? You
know, that the mule deer population would survive through eons going forward. But you could never hunt them again. What would you do? And he's like, easy. I'd never hunt them again.
Right.
There's sadly people who wouldn't make that deal. So it's I think it's you gotta look introspectively into yourself and ask why you do the things you do. It's an interesting question with the CWD issue on the rise and with it being out there and it. What happens, let's say, if the infection spread to such a degree that and you learn a few other things where it was crossing over into human infection, and it's like, okay, now you're not actually consuming the animal flesh. Like you just stop eating it. Ranella brought up the question, like, would you hunt if you can't eat it? And how many hunters would hunt if you can't eat? And it's a serious, like, well, gosh, if I can't eat it, it's like for me, fishing. Yeah. I'll do a little fly fishing here and there, but I got to tell you, if I can't keep the fish, I'm really not motivated to fish. And there are other guys, that's all they're about is catch and release. And
but we're still going to need hunters to manage deer populations for sure. So I hope there's enough interest in those areas that, you know, hunting is the absolute best agent for managing deer populations. So I think
he just brought it up like, gosh, how many people would not go out and hunt anymore if they couldn't keep the meat? And it could be surprisingly a large portion, even though they know it's good for the animals. Because the meat is a huge motivation, especially more so now than I think 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's really exciting too about some of the locavores and some of that movement in hunting. That's really gonna help us. It may save us.
Yeah. Well, I know you have to catch a plane.
I do.
So I'm glad you sat down with me though today. It's our last day at the Western Hunt Expo, and I've got a lot of articles here that you have written and part of. I'm going to go through these and where can people find this kind of stuff?
Yeah, a lot of the articles that I wrote are on my website, deernut.com.
Okay.
Just singular, deernut. And I have a book, Deer of the Southwest, which is out of print right now, but it will come back into print next month in March, and that'll be available on that website. But I also
Deer of the Southwest.
And so it's Coues, Whitetail, desert mule deer in the entire Southwest, including Mexico.
Those desert mule deer are awesome.
It pulls everything we know about them together. They are. I love those. I love desert mule deer.
Yeah, so yeah, remind me of that, and I'll put it on Instagram and post it. I'll get the book and read that.
You know, I went on Amazon to buy a couple of my own books just to bring them for you and to give one to Randy and I went on there, looked, and since they're out of print, the cheapest used tattered one was $47, and someone had a brand new one for $656. That makes me feel good that my book is apparently worth $656. But I was actually going to buy one and bring one to you, but I wasn't going to pay you $600 for a book for you. They'll be out in a month or so.
All right, and then Arizona Game and Fish. I had a blast down there. Yeah. I want to thank you guys for having us in camp.
I hope you guys will keep doing that because that's fun. You can come down and hunt just so many things.
I'm already like putting out the feelers, looking for my Coues fix in 2018. Where am I going to get it? How am I going to get it? It's funny. I've walked around this Western Hunt Expo, and do you know what mount I've looked for the most?
The Coues Whitetail.
Coues Whitetail. I'm like looking in each booth trying to find those, and then when I just stop and stare at it for a long time. We saw one really big buck, and I got the film from Randy that first day, and now that thing's stuck in my head. They're just a cool deer. The coat, the shape.
When I see like a Wisconsin deer, and I grew up in Wisconsin, the big northern whitetails just look ugly to me with their white antlers. And you look at these little dainty southwestern Coues whitetail with their little baskets. They're just the prettiest of the whitetails.
One thing that seems telltale with a Coues buck is the old ones is mass.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to put on mass, like not so much spread or tine length as much as mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and non-typicals aren't really, I think, as common as a lot of whitetails in other places.
Mm-hmm.
You get that little classic basket shape.
And I'm a sucker for mass. Anything that looks piggish and mass, like heavy. I'm like, I don't care if it's stubby and like 3 inches long, as long as it's fat, heavy. So Coues. A lot of the bucks I've seen around here seem to have mass more than tine length and spread, and that's neat. So they're cool deer. So
yeah, they are.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep.
Appreciate it, folks. Check out Arizona Game and Fish. Go down there and hunt yourself a Coati, and some Coues and some jackrabbits and some pheasant,
quail and
doves, and duck.
Yeah,
we saw some tons of duck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So. Great hunt, man. I hope people get excited about that. It's a neat place.
Yep.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it, man.
You bet. Thank you.
Gritty. Despite our ever-changing, ever-indignant world with its growing ignorance of and indifference to the ways of the wild, I remain a predator, pitying those who revel in artificiality and synthetic success while regarding me and my kind as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood. I stalk a real world of dark wood and tall grass stirred by a restless wind blowing across sunlit water and beneath star-strewn sky. And on those occasions when I choose to kill, to claim some small part of nature's bounty for my own, I do so by choice, quickly, with the learned efficiency of a skilled hunter. Further, in my heart and mind, I know the truth and make no apologies for my actions or my place and time. Others around me may opt to eat only plants, nuts, and fruits. Still others may employ faceless strangers to procure their meats, their leather, their feathers, and all those niceties and necessities of life. Such is their right, of course, and I wish them well. All I ask in return is no one begrudge me, and all of us who may answer the primordial stirrings within our hunter souls, my right to do some of these things myself. What you just heard is a quote from M.R. James. We truly live in a world that is largely ignorant and indifferent to the ways of the wild. And although some regard us as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood, we have the opportunity to change the way these people view the hunter and the hunt. We can share our experiences and nature's bounty with those who employ these faceless strangers. And by so doing, we make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for the wild animals and the wild places we care so deeply about. Never stop sharing your passion for hunting and the outdoors. Our wild animals and our wild places depend on it.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to The Gritty Bowman.
Gritty Bowman.